The Madrid sun felt like a heavy, warm wool blanket. I sat in the Plaza de Oriente, watching the light bounce off the white stone. My phone vibrated against the table, shattering the quiet peace of my afternoon. It was Amber. She was shrieking so loud I had to pull the device away. While I was in Madrid, my parents gave my sister the keys to my house, without knowing that I sold it 2 weeks ago. Now, strangers were screaming back. Amber's voice was a jagged blade of pure, titled panic. She kept yelling about intruders and calling the police on the people in her living room. I didn't interrupt her. I just leaned back and watched a pigeon peck at a stray crumb near my shoe. The icy condensation on my wine glass felt honest against my palm. I knew exactly what she had done. She used the emergency key I never retrieved to enter my sanctuary. I took a slow sip while the siren started wailing in the distance. To understand my silence, you have to understand the architecture of guilt. For 32 years, I was the load-bearing wall of the family. My purpose was to stand sturdy so Amber could dance without getting wet. My parents, Jeffrey and Holly, built a home based on utility rather than love. They celebrated my grit only because it meant I was low maintenance. I was a safety net they wove to catch Amber every time she inevitably fell. They never looked at me. They looked through me. 2 years ago, I bought a downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Sound. Every stock option and late-night research hour paid for those quartz countertops. When my parents visited, they didn't see my success. They saw a family asset. My mother touched the stone and complained it was wasteful for one person. My father calculated the liquidation value in his head. They didn't see my name on the deed. They saw a guest room for the golden child. The job offer from Lisbon was my secret lifeline out of the cage. I knew if I left the condo empty, they would move Amber in by Tuesday. So I chose a different path. I sold the property off, market to a young couple, and told my parents I hired a management company. The lie felt as smooth as silk. I boarded the plane with 2 suitcases and a one-way ticket. I left behind a ghost house. I thought I was finally out. I was wrong. I dialed Ryan Cooper, the man who actually owned the condo. He answered on the first ring, his voice vibrating with adrenaline. He told me a blonde woman was currently screaming at his pregnant wife. I told him to put me on speakerphone immediately. I heard the rustle of the phone moving. Then Amber's shrill voice cut through the air. I didn't hesitate. I told the police officer that my sister was trespassing and to remove her. The silence that followed was absolute. The sirens at my old condo in Seattle faded over the line, replaced by a heavy, static-filled quiet. I stood up and paced the cobblestones of the plaza, my heels clicking like a countdown. My objective was simple: terminate the family drama before it reached my new life. But Amber's sobbing started again, a wet and desperate sound that signaled a shift. She wasn't just angry anymore. She sounded terrified. My parents had already arrived at the scene to defend their golden child. My phone screen lit up with a second incoming call from my father. I ignored it, focusing instead on the calm breathing of Ryan Cooper. He was the one holding the power now, not my parents. Ryan thanked me for the confirmation, but his tone remained clipped and professional. He mentioned that my father was currently trying to bribe the responding officers. Jeffrey always thought money could fix any boundary violation. I felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in my stomach. A new email notification slid across the top of my screen. It was an urgent message from my former boss, back in Washington. I opened it while still listening to the chaos in Ryan's background. The blood drained from my face as I read the first sentence. Ryan Cooper was not just a random buyer. He was the chief financial officer for Pinnacle Group. They were the largest account at my father's firm. The power balance had just shifted into nuclear territory. I realized then that this was no longer a simple family squabble over a house. My father had spent 15 years cultivating Ryan Cooper over expensive scotch and golf. Now, he was standing on Ryan's new porch, shouting at the police and demanding entry. Jeffrey was inadvertently dismantling his own career in front of his biggest client. He didn't know he was screaming at the man who signed his paychecks. I stared at the distant shimmering water of the Tagus River. I finally swiped to accept my father's persistent call on a three-way merge. His voice was a panicked roar that nearly distorted the tiny speaker. He demanded I tell the officers there had been a massive clerical error. He wanted me to lie and say the management company had made a mistake. Jeffrey didn't ask how I was doing in Europe. He only asked me to set my own reputation on fire. He needed a scapegoat to save his firm. "I won't lie for you, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his frantic bluster. The silence that followed was more chilling than the screaming. I told him exactly who Ryan Cooper was, and watched the realization hit him through the phone. I could almost hear the gears of his mind grinding to a halt. He stopped shouting and began to plead. The man who never apologized was suddenly begging for mercy. He knew the Pinnacle account was already gone. I ended the call and blocked every single one of them, in 3 swift taps. My hands were shaking, but not from fear or regret. It was pure adrenaline. I walked toward a small iron table and ordered a strong espresso. The waiter smiled, oblivious to the bridge I had just burned across the Atlantic. I felt light, as if I had finally shed a skin that never fit. Then, my bank app pinned with an unexpected, massive wire transfer. The espresso arrived, dark and steaming. As I stared at the bank notification on my phone, the wire transfer was for $50,000, sent from my mother's personal savings account. It was a desperate, silent bribe to buy back my loyalty. My objective shifted from simple escape to total structural demolition. I realized then that they still thought I had a price. They believed money could rebuild the bridge I had just soaked in gasoline and torched. I looked at the transaction details with a grim smile. This was the tuition money they claimed they never had when I was working 3 jobs. It was the resilience fund they had hoarded while I scanned groceries at 3 in the morning. Seeing that specific amount felt like a physical slap to my face. It wasn't an apology for the trespass. It was a down payment on my silence. My mother was finally desperate enough to be honest. A shadow fell over my table as a man in a sharp suit approached. He looked like the local version of my father, polished and dangerous. He introduced himself as a legal representative for the firm I had just joined in Lisbon. He held a tablet, showing a series of frantic messages from Jeffrey. My father was trying to sue my new employers for predatory hiring. He was attempting to destroy my professional future to force me home. The lawyer sat down, his expression unreadable and cold. He explained that my father's claims were baseless, but incredibly loud. This was Jeffrey's final tactic. If he couldn't own my house, he would own my reputation. He was telling my new bosses that I was mentally unstable. The pressure in my chest spiked as I realized how far they would go. They weren't just parasites anymore. They were active predators. I had to end this play now. I turned the tablet toward me and began typing a response. I didn't write to my father or the lawyers. I sent a single, high-resolution scan of the original sales deed to Ryan Cooper. I added a note about the $50,000 bribe my mother had just attempted. Subtext was dead. It was time for the raw data to speak. By exposing the bribe, I was cutting off their last retreat. I felt the cold wind off the river. The lawyer watched me, a slow nod of approval showing on his face. He told me that Pinnacle Group had officially blacklisted my father's firm an hour ago. The news was already hitting the Seattle business circles like a shockwave. My father wasn't just losing an account. He was losing his entire legacy. The vacuum of competence I had created was finally swallowing them whole. I felt a strange lightness. It was the weight of a ghost leaving. I stood up and walked toward the edge of the plaza. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, golden shadows across the stone. My phone buzzed one last time with a message from an unknown number. It was Amber, pleading for a place to stay tonight. She said the police had barred her from the street. I didn't reply. I simply watched the ferry cross the water. Then I saw a familiar face in the crowd. The woman approaching my table was Ryan Cooper's sister, Sarah. She lived in Lisbon and held a thick manila envelope against her chest. My objective was to secure a formal witness statement to bury my father's legal threats. Sarah looked shaken, her eyes red from a long flight, or perhaps just the news. She sat down without an invitation and slid the papers across the iron table. The air between us grew heavy with the scent of salt water. Sarah explained that the police in Seattle had found something else inside the condo. Amber hadn't just used an emergency key to enter the building. She had brought a professional locksmith to change the deadbolts before my parents even arrived. This wasn't a spontaneous visit sparked by a family whim. It was a premeditated takeover aimed at establishing legal residency. My sister was trying to squat in a house I no longer owned. The betrayal felt absolute. The legal pressure escalated when Sarah revealed my father's next move. Jeffrey had filed a missing persons report against me in 2 different countries. He was claiming that I was being held against my will in Portugal. This was his way of bypassing international privacy laws to track my location. He wanted my bank accounts frozen until I returned to Seattle for an evaluation. The audacity of his desperation made my hands go cold. He was hunting me. I looked at the documents Sarah brought, my mind racing through technical simulations. I needed a counter-strike that Jeffrey couldn't anticipate or bribe his way through. I realized that my father's own firm had handled the initial escrow paperwork for the condo years ago. There was a signature on those files that proved he knew I held sole title. If he claimed I was missing now, he was admitting to perjury in the past. I saw his weak point. I pulled out my laptop and accessed the secure cloud drive I had prepared. I didn't just have the sales from 2 weeks ago. I had 15 years of recorded conversations and itemized receipts of the family taxes I had paid. I showed Sarah the digital ledger of every cent I had funneled back into their lives. The subtext of our meeting changed instantly. She wasn't just a messenger. She was a witness to a long-term financial extortion. Sarah's expression hardened as she read through the digital logs. She agreed to testify that my father had attempted to harass the new owners. The power balance swung back toward my side of the Atlantic. My father's attempt to use the law as a weapon was about to backfire. I felt a surge of adrenaline that replaced the lingering fatigue. We drafted a formal cease and desist order that would be served at the police station. The sun finally vanished, leaving the plaza in a deep, velvet blue. Sarah stood up and thanked me for protecting her brother's new home. She walked away, disappearing into the night crowd near the tram lines. I felt a sense of finality as I closed my laptop. The legal walls were closing in on Jeffrey and Amber back in Seattle. Then, I noticed a strange, blinking light on my phone. It was a live feed from my doorbell. The doorbell notification pulsed on my screen, like a warning light. My objective was to monitor the condo remotely, but the visual froze me. I watched the grainy video feed from Seattle, 4,000 miles away. Amber was sitting on the curb, her face buried in her hands. Beside her stood my mother, Holly, who was frantically pointing at the smart lock. They didn't realize the camera was recording every desperate word. The betrayal was now visible in high definition. The pressure intensified as Jeffrey stepped into the frame, clutching a crowbar. My heart hammered against my ribs while I watched my father prepare to commit a felony. He wasn't just trespassing anymore, he was planning a forced entry into a stranger's home. I realized they were completely unhinged by the loss of their financial safety net. The Seattle rain made the pavement slick and dark. They looked like ghosts haunting a life that no longer belonged to them. I tapped the microphone icon on my phone, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. Drop the bar. Jeffrey? I said, the audio projecting clearly from the porch speaker. All three of them jumped, their heads whipping toward the small camera lens. The power balance shifted instantly as they realized I was watching their every move. My father's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked directly at me through the digital eye. "You're going to jail if you swing that," I told him. My voice was cold and detached, a sharp contrast to his frantic breathing. Jeffrey hesitated, the heavy metal bar trembling in his grip. He started shouting about family loyalty and the money they had invested in my life. I didn't argue or defend my choices. I simply held up my laptop screen to my own camera. It showed the police dispatcher already on the line. The threat was real. Holly grabbed Jeffrey's arm, her face pale under the streetlights. She whispered something I couldn't hear, but the crowbar finally clattered onto the concrete. The tension broke, leaving a hollow, echoing silence on the porch. They looked defeated, stripped of the authority they had wielded for 3 decades. I watched them retreat toward their car. Their shoulders slumped against the damp wind. They were finally realizing the vacuum of competence was absolute. I felt a sudden, sharp relief. I closed the app and took a deep breath of the salt, tinged Lisbon air. The immediate threat of the break-in had passed, but the professional war was still raging. I knew the morning would bring a new wave of legal filings and accusations. My phone chimed again, but it wasn't a family member this time. It was an encrypted message from an anonymous source. It contained a PDF of my father's secret offshore business accounts. The stakes were rising. I stared at the document, realizing Jeffrey had been hiding money for years. While I was working night shifts, he was funneling firm profits into a shell company. This was the leverage I needed to end his legal pursuit forever. But as I scrolled down, I saw a name that stopped my breath. Amber was listed as the primary beneficiary of the secret fund. My sister wasn't broke, she was an active participant in the fraud. The trap was deeper. I stared at the offshore account ledgers, the glowing screen illuminating the dark plaza. My objective was to verify the extent of Amber's involvement in Jeffrey's fraud. If she was a beneficiary, her hysterical poverty was a performance. I scrolled through the line items, matching dates to moments she had begged me for rent money. The numbers were staggering and precise. Each deposit into her account coincided with a crisis I had solved with my own savings. I felt a cold, jagged betrayal. The pressure built as I realized the legal implications for me. As the former primary contact for Jeffrey's firm, my name was on the initial compliance documents. If the authorities flagged these accounts, I could be implicated in the shell company's activities. I had to prove I was a victim of their manipulation, not a silent partner. I messaged the anonymous source, asking for the origin of the leak. My pulse was a steady thrum in my ears. The hunt was becoming a fight for survival. A reply flashed instantly, containing a single photograph of a familiar office desk. It was my own old desk in Seattle, currently occupied by a junior analyst. The source was a whistleblower inside Jeffrey's firm, who had watched the golden child drain the accounts. They had seen the disparity and decided to burn the building down. I realized the firm was already under internal investigation by the state auditors. The walls weren't just closing in, they were already on fire. I had very little time. I contacted the Lisbon legal representative again, my fingers flying across the keys. I needed to turn this evidence over to Ryan Cooper and the Pinnacle Group. By providing the fraud data, I would cement my status as a whistleblower rather than a co-conspirator. The turn happened when the lawyer revealed a new detail. Jeffrey had just attempted to wire the remaining firm capital to a bank in the Cayman Islands. He was planning to flee the country tonight. My heart skipped a beat. The professional disaster was now a criminal pursuit involving the federal authorities. I sent the offshore files to Ryan Cooper with a short, clinical explanation of the fraud. I didn't add any emotional pleas or excuses for my family. The data was the only currency that mattered in this market. I watched the delivered icon appear on the screen. The power balance had finally tilted so far that Jeffrey could never recover. He was no longer a father, he was a target. I waited in the silence of the plaza, the cool wind tugging at my hair. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed Ryan Cooper's personal number. He sounded remarkably calm for a man who had just discovered a massive fraud. Ryan told me the police were already at the airport intercepting my father. He thanked me for the documentation and promised to protect my professional standing. The immediate danger was neutralizing, but a new realization hit me. Amber was still missing from the airport. I checked the doorbell camera feed again, searching for any sign of my sister. The porch was empty, but a dark SUV was idling at the curb. I zoomed in on the license plate and felt a sickening jolt of recognition. It belonged to a local bail bondsman Jeffrey had used for his clients. Amber wasn't fleeing with him. She was staying behind to clean out the condo's safe. She thought she could still harvest the remaining assets before the feds arrived. She was wrong. I used the smart home app to trigger the high-decibel security alarm. The piercing sound echoed through the Seattle street, visible on the choppy video feed. Amber bolted from the side door, clutching a small leather bag to her chest. She looked like a cornered animal, frantic and small under the orange streetlights. She tripped over the crowbar Jeffrey had abandoned on the concrete. The bag spilled open, revealing stacks of cash and several gold watches. She was finally caught in her own trap. The police arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I watched as they handcuffed Amber and led her toward the patrol car. She didn't look at the camera this time. She just stared at her own feet. The architecture of guilt had finally collapsed under the weight of its own greed. I felt a profound sense of exhaustion. The war was over, but the landscape was unrecognizable. I closed the app for the last time. The lawyer stood up and offered me a hand, his expression softened by a rare smile. He told me the firm in Lisbon was proud to have such a decisive researcher. I had protected their interests, and my own name with surgical precision. I walked away from the plaza, my steps light on the ancient stone. I was alone, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a deficit. I was free of the load, bearing burden. Then, a new message appeared from an unknown number. I stared at the unknown number, my thumb hovering over the glass screen. My objective was to sever the final connection to Seattle before the sun rose. I expected a final curse from my mother or a legal threat from a remaining partner. Instead, the message was a digital receipt from a local storage facility near the airport. It showed a high capacitance registered in my name 6 months ago. Someone had used my identity to hide the physical evidence of the firm's fraud. The pressure mounted as I realized the unit contained the original paper ledgers. If the authorities found those files under my name, the whistleblower defense would crumble into dust. I had to prove I never authorized that rental before the investigators arrived at the gate. My father had left one last trap, to ensure I would go down with the ship. The evening air felt suddenly colder as I realized the depth of his malice. Jeffrey had planned for my betrayal years ago. I contacted the storage facility's manager, my voice dropping into a sharp, commanding tone. I demanded the security footage for the day the unit was leased in my name. The turn came when the manager described the person who signed the contract. It wasn't my father or Amber. It was a woman who looked exactly like me, wearing my old coat. My mother, Holly, had impersonated me to create a paper trail of guilt. The betrayal now had a face I once loved. This new detail changed the power balance from defensive to purely aggressive. I realized that my mother wasn't just a passive enabler in this family war. She was the one who managed the logistics of our collective destruction, while Jeffrey blustered. I sent the manager's contact information directly to the federal agents handling the airport arrest. I also forwarded the photo of the coat Holly had stolen from my closet. I was done being the silent, load-bearing daughter for these people. I watched the digital clock on my phone tick toward midnight in Seattle. The authorities were now sweeping the storage facility, uncovering the evidence Holly had hidden. My objective was finally within reach, as the lead investigator sent a brief confirmation. They had found the fake identification my mother used to sign the lease. The impersonation charge would ensure she couldn't hide behind Jeffrey's shadow. I felt a surge of cold clarity. The family structure was not just broken. It was pulverized. The legal representative in Lisbon checked his watch and stood up to leave. He told me the firm had already drafted a press release regarding my assistance. I had moved from a potential liability to a celebrated asset in a single night. I walked toward the river, the water reflecting the city's ancient, golden lights. I felt a strange sense of mourning for a version of myself that was gone. The low-maintenance girl had finally decided to become a high-consequence woman. I sat on a stone bench and watched the first tram of the night rattle by. My phone buzzed again, but this time I didn't feel the familiar jolt of panic. It was a message from Ryan Cooper, sent from his new kitchen. He attached a photo of the nursery his wife was finally starting to paint. They were safe in the sanctuary I had fought so hard to protect. It was the only thank you note that actually mattered. I smiled at the small victory. However, the serenity was interrupted by a final, unexpected realization in my bank app. The $50,000 bribe my mother sent was still sitting in my account. I realized I couldn't just keep it or send it back to a frozen fund. I needed to move that money where it'd do the most damage to their legacy. I initiated a transfer to the legal aid fund for victims of white-collar crime. It was a poetic end to their stolen hoard. I watched the pending status on the screen, knowing my account would soon hit zero. I stood up, ready to walk back to my new apartment in the Alfama district. The air smelled of grilled sardines and salt, a scent that now meant home. I deleted the doorbell app and the secret folders I had used for combat. I was stepping out of the room that had been running out of oxygen. I felt a lightness in my chest that was entirely new. I was no longer a resource to be harvested. I was just Penny. As I turned the corner, I saw a familiar manila envelope tucked into my doorway. Sarah must have come back while I was at the plaza to leave it. I picked it up and found a handwritten note inside. It wasn't about the case or the house in Seattle. It was a list of the best local bakeries and a key to her garden. I realized that I had finally built a bridge worth crossing. Then, I heard a car door slam nearby. I stepped toward my apartment door, clutching the manila envelope Sarah had left. My objective was finally to cross my own threshold and lock the world away. The slamming car door echoed through the narrow street, and a shadow moved near the limestone archway. I felt the familiar spike of adrenaline, thinking my father had somehow slipped the net. But it was just the Lisbon morning fog rolling in from the coast. The phantom of my old life still haunted my peripheral vision. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped into the cool, dark foyer. My hands finally stopped shaking as I realized the silence was absolute and permanent. The weight of the last 24 hours settled into my bones like lead. I threw the envelope on the small side table and headed toward the balcony. I needed to see the sun rise over a world where I owed nothing to anyone. The vacuum of competence was finally filled with my own peace. 6 months later, I sat at a small iron table in the Alfama district. The air smelled of salt and warm custard from a nearby bakery. I watched the yellow tram rattle down the steep cobblestones against the blue sky. I had blocked every number and deleted every social media account tied to Seattle. My life was small, quiet, and entirely my own. I learned through an old colleague that Jeffrey's firm had officially declared bankruptcy. The golden child was finally working. Amber was now a receptionist at a dental office, earning her own way. Without my subsidies, she had finally been forced to learn how to walk. It wasn't cruel. It was the most necessary thing I had ever done. My parents were surviving, though they likely blamed me for every misfortune they faced. I didn't care about their narrative anymore. I was no longer a load, bearing wall in their crumbling house. I was just a woman drinking her espresso. I took a bite of a warm pastry, the crust sticking to my lips. For 32 years, I thought solitude was a punishment for being difficult. Now, I realized it was the ultimate victory for being brave. I had burned every bridge to stop myself from crossing back over them. The fire had been bright, hot, and cleansing. I looked at the Tagus River shimmering like liquid gold in the distance. I felt light, airy, and impossibly free in the morning heat. I am solitary, I am selfish, and I am finally alive. My phone remained silent on the table, a tool for my joy rather than a leash. I watched a group of tourists laugh as they climbed the hill toward the castle. They were just strangers in a beautiful city, and I was one of them. I took a final sip of my bitter, perfect coffee. Then, I noticed a small, handwritten letter tucked into my mailbox. It was postmarked from a prison.